click my the record now and read my clapboard, which says Reading Plato Summer 2021, Week 6. What is Platonism? Oh, we're finally going to answer that. That's great. So we're also going to answer what is philosophy and what is wisdom today. So, you know, you'll all be sorted by the end of the class. We will do a little bit more on that exercise to start with. Then we'll get to the final reading, and then we'll have the discussion about 7:30 over a glass of wine or whatever. Okay, so so far in the course, pretty much the whole course, what is philosophy? What is wisdom? So for Plato, it's all about turning around. Looking around, not turning the bodily around, but turning around the attention of your mind's eye. Not looking out for reality in the particularity of sensible things, but inward to their formal nature. And this idea of their formal nature, or the formal nature of your experience, is something that, you know, I've been trying to draw your attention to through this course in the exercises and also in reading Plato. You see, when we look at particular sensible things, because they feel so concrete. Oh, hello. Someone hasn't got their mute on. That's all right. I don't know whether, Jackie, if it happens again, if you could just go into the participants and just turn the mute on. Anyway, you see what we're looking at. Yeah, when you look at particular things, they feel so concrete, right? Especially as adults, you know, we've been talking about it's not so much when you're 6 months or 12 months old. We tend to consider that their being is in their independent particularity. We suppose that their essential being is this particularity. And then by some force of contortion, which we've gone through, the modern view proposes that this essence is some material reality beyond sense, beyond knowing, an unknown and unknowable reality to which we refer for all our knowledge. So this is that kind of correspondence where you've got the cup, which is in your experience, but the material cup is unknown beyond it and somehow corresponding with it. The irony of this conclusion is that it kind of starts off by affirming that what we immediately know in our senses, God, I know my cup. I'm not a bloody idealist. I know my cup. But it ends up by saying that what we know, the essential thing that is known in our senses is beyond our senses, beyond our experience. So it's actually absent in our experience. So Plato rejects this absurdity. But this is not to reject experience. My cup is real and immediate in my senses. It's not to reject empirical science. And that's been a big misunderstanding about Plato down through the centuries. I mean, Platonism in a big way invented modern science. Rather, it is to interpret sensible experience differently, to pay attention to how I construct my sensible objects from my experience. It notices in things that they have a common formal nature. Platonism is about paying attention to this formal nature. Consider the problem. What is knowledge? What do I know? What is the being of the object that I know? Now, we've tried, as other philosophers have done, to ground our knowledge in external materiality of particular things. Of course, it's out there, solid and independent from me. But this just doesn't seem to work because everything I know is in my senses and the objects I construct from my senses are in my mind. They're in me. How else can we ground our knowledge? Now, we have tried. as other philosophers had, to ground it linguistically by grounding a word in its meaning. But its meaning can only be expressed by other words, and then those in more words. And so it goes, meaning to meaning, more words, on and on forever. Platonism grounds our knowledge via the concept or idea or form. The cup is grounded via the concept of the cup. If I were to fashion a cup out of clay, then I might fashion it according to this model. If I were to define it in words, I would define it according to this model. I know what a cup's like. What words will I use to describe it? Will those words work? Likewise, for pure concepts, justice is grounded in the concept of justice. This is its formal nature. This is where the essence of its idea, meaning, thingness resides. Their essence is not particular, but general, and it is invisible, insensible. It's not in the senses. So what can we say about this formal essential nature and its relation to things? Remember, we recited the mantra of the Platonists and Pythagoreans: the essence of things is like the essence of number. And we considered the number 2. Now I'm going to share a screen so we can look at some visuals here, and let me know if you don't see the slides. All right. Okay, so the essence of things is like the essence of number. And so now we consider what is 2. Not what is a particular 2, but what is 2 in itself. We can point to 2 things. We can point to 2 marks on the page. But 2 itself is conceptual, insensible. But I can show you by example. Do you see what I mean by 2? In a similar way, Plato is saying that non-geometric forms like, or non-geometric forms like justice, beauty, equality, can be shown by likeness, using examples or analogies. And this is where knowledge is grounded, according to Plato. So it's really hard to see how you get from this to justice or beauty at this stage. But don't worry so much about that. The important thing here is to try and see numbers or geometric forms clearly and do things in stages. Now, we've asked what 2 is. Now, what about 1? What is 1? Now, in a way, what we're asking here is so simple that that's actually the problem. Oneness of things, 1 cup, 1 stone, 1 beautiful building, 1 beautiful boy, 1 herd of cattle. Every time we make a distinction, we refer to something, or even we refer to a collective, there's a oneness about it. There's a oneness about an object in our world, because it is what it is. It's one in that it is that object. For Plato, one thing partakes in oneness in this non-arbitrary way. We can recognize one without defining it or proving it. It's about showing. I show you these things, not saying, not giving them meaning or something. Do you see what I mean by 1? This is the foundation. So let's go back to likeness and unlikeness, sameness and difference. Remember, we came across that in the Phaedo as a very special form. Consider how 2 objects consider how 2 objects are similar. these two ships or images of ships are similar. They have the same proportions. They have the same internal proportions. They're just different sizes. And we do this sort of thing all the time if we're working on computers. You need to, you can stretch them out so they don't have the proportions, but they don't look right, and they lose that similarity. And the same with two cups, right? They are similar in that they're in cups. Maybe they have a very similar shape, but these cups might be dissimilar in terms of their texture, in terms of their color. And we can think about when we compare things that the comparison is made up of their sameness and their difference. And in a sense, we can divide it all up. We can say, well, they're the same in this way and they're different in that way. But remember that sameness has its own essential difference. What is one? One is the same as itself and not other than itself. One is the same as itself and not other than itself. With any particular one, you know what it is and you know what it is not. You can recognize one without defining it or proving it. Do you see what I mean? So there is one and there is not one. One, not one. And we're thinking about this here geometrically. There's the inside and the outside, which we've dealt with before. So using geometry, as we have in the past, we can think of the other in the same. The other in the same of one is not one. And this comes back up in a very important passage in the Republic, if ever you will read that. This is the amazing but simple recognition of what we already know. But perhaps we never really thought about it in this way. My cup is itself, and also not itself. One is one, and not one. And in the same way, other forms, just and unjust. And it's a 3-in-1 distinction, which we were chatting about last week. And it's 3-in-1 in the sense that you can't pull any of the 3 out and talk about them separately. It's all in one. The distinction between inside and outside. The distinction between inside and outside. The distinction between same and other. It's a differential value, if you like. One's brought forward and one's in the background. The unity of the form is in this distinction. Now, we've used the example of the island and the sea for the static form, and I hope that's working well for you. The distinction between inside and outside, sameness and difference. In this case, we say the island, if you like, the land, distinguished from the sea by the shoreline. So this is the same other distinction. And when we say, I'm standing on the island, I don't say that I'm standing on the island, not the sea, but in fact, that's what I mean. It is implicit, because if the sea went away, you wouldn't be saying you're standing on the island. So in general, sometimes this is just called that same and other in Plato in his later works. 3-in-1 distinction, inside and outside, same and other. The other is in the same as what it is not. And this is what's meant when we say in Platonism, the other is in the same. When someone says that, or when I say that, this is what I mean by the other being in the same. It's in the distinction of the island or of the same. There must be another, but the other is in the background. And this is actually a good way sometimes to think about it too. Think about foreground and background, especially in a very simple image like this one of the kangaroo that you might see on a sign by the road. You must have the background in order to distinguish the kangaroo. If you remove the background, I've left the outline there, but if you remove the background, you can see that it's hard to see the kangaroo. So foreground needs its background. Background's still background, and foreground's what's important, but it needs its background. And this is also in a way highlighted in these ambiguous foreground background sort of images, where at one point, and you can play with some other ones that you might find on the internet. If you bring in your distinction, the black to the forward, maybe you see a vase. If you bring in the distinction the white to the forward, then you see the faces. And there's hopefully you can see that actually one follows the other, and the same as pain follows pleasure and pleasure follows pain, as we started off with the Phaedo. It's one follows the other, but they're not there together. You either do the faces or you do the vase, and some other images of this sort are much more clear in that respect. So that's a good one to play with. All right, so that's probably enough about that. Well, we can probably have a bit of a, I might just finish this off and just as the final discussion about this exercise. So what are we talking about here? What are we talking about? How Plato claims that we construct our world different from the regular, sensible, materialistic way that we all know about or think we know about. So notice how we construct the world as we go, by finding difference, by finding and seeing difference, by seeing how there is a difference here and a difference there. We thought about this when we imagined how the newborn baby constructed its world from its sensual experience. At first, there's all this undistinguished kind of white noise of chaos. Then the baby starts to make distinctions in its experience. It starts to construct difference. And in this way, it makes its world. More relatable examples for us grown-ups are examples of ways in which we construct our world, different parts of our world, in our adult experience. And we talked about a language. When we're learning a language, when we first heard the language, it's just all this kind of noise going on. And then we start to learn and distinguish, and we draw out the different distinctions. Oh, I recognize that word, I recognize that word, and so on. Or another thing is like, you know, when you go to Aunt Agatha's farm and she's got all those chickens and they've all got names. Everyone's got a name. And you go, that's ridiculous, you know, like they all look the same. But you stay a week or two and you're calling them by their names. You see how Betsy is different than Dottie, and that Dottie is completely different from Bossy. We create our experience in this sort of way. And if you can take that to the extreme, you can start to understand this different sort of view where you don't have these particular external objects presenting reality to you. In this way, in this form, I construct my world from my experience, including my experience of you. I don't know you as you know yourself. I only know you as my experience of you. I surmise that you are another observer like me. As Steve was saying, this comes quite late in the child's development. But I worked that out, right? But I don't know when you say you see yellow, what you actually see. I know what I see. I don't know what you see. or red or blue. I know that it corresponds in your behavior. I know that it corresponds with what I call yellow, but I don't know your experience. I construct all that in my experience, and it's a sophisticated construction. Can you see how the cause of my experience might be external? Even so, I don't cause my experience to be the way it is. I don't cause my experience of yellow. I don't cause my experience of the tea going cold. Nevertheless, my experience is my experience in me. That is one of the most difficult things to kind of work out in Platonism. How you don't cause your experience, well, you do cause it in some ways, but there's important ways that you don't cause your experience. But you still construct it. I construct my world from my experience, and likewise, you construct yours. And that is how we have shared experience. That is how we have our more or less shared objects. We communicate, we make the same distinctions. This is how we share experience, like the experience of my cup. So there you have it. That's it. Essentially, that is Platonism. Platonism is the formal approach by looking up, not down, or by turning around to look inwards. Platonism is completely reflexive. Looking inward, it's self-referencing. It's always referring back on itself. There's no reference to a supposed external world beyond what I sense or know. And the formal nature of everything is an opposite nature. Everything has its hidden other. So that's it. That's what it's about. Now, no one expects you to fully get this. Oh, I am sorry. I've just let my phone ring. Which I can't find. Sorry about that. That has not happened before. So that's about it. And no one really expects you to get this the first time round, but it's giving you a bit of an idea of, giving you a bit of a taste of what's going on. It's quite an extreme view, and it may not interest you, or it may interest you. And but I will tell you that if you do go on from this, the same stuff will come up again and again. Participation, learning is recollection, the forms, more about the forms and the opposites and so on. So if you do another course, it'll be reinforcing what you've already done, going over it again and again in different contexts. And in that way, most people say, a lot easier to take in. I have thrown you in the deep end just so you can get a taste and see if it's something for you. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And any questions, comments, or reflections before we look at today's reading?
Yeah, just about distinction. And if we, like, I'm thinking about distinction, that's my sense of distinction. You know, like I would make a distinction according to how I sensed it. So my distinction as well can be different to other people's distinctions.
That's right. But if you're at Aunt Agatha's farm and she's saying, you know, notice the flecks of black on the wing, you know, that's Betsy, or notice, you know, this one's bossing all the other chickens around, that's Bossy, you know. We do make the distinctions in a shared way.
Yeah.
And so we can make, you know, we can, and you know, we remember as children, we Like, for example, we get the meaning of words wrong or something, and so we make the wrong distinction associated with that word, and then it can be embarrassing. But then you are socially aligned through communication. That's the idea. But certainly, especially when you do work on your own, like, for example, I remember working on cars as a kid, and I had no idea of what all the parts were called, but I gave them my own names. You know, I made the distinction between the different parts in the engine. And so you certainly can have your own private distinctions. And that's really where this is all grounded. But socially, through communication, we make them all come into harmony. And that's really how, you know, society works, by everyone finding agreement there. Does that make sense, Stu?
Yeah, it does. It does. I always, for me, the easiest thing about, you know, seeing something completely differently, even though it's supposed to be the same, I always refer to colour blindness, because for years and years and years as a child, I thought what I now know as the colour purple was the colour navy blue. But it wasn't until I started, as I got older, started saying that purple thing. And then people say, no, that's navy blue. So I still don't know what it is.
That's right.
Only what they've told me what it is.
Well, you're lucky in a way you're lucky in a way by having that problem.
Yeah, yeah.
Because a lot of other people don't have that problem, because you cannot make that distinction.
No, I can't.
And so you became aware that you can't make that distinction. Now, a lot of other people you deal with couldn't imagine what that's like.
Mm. Yeah.
I've got another, if I can come in here. As you were talking, Bernie, talking about being able to sort of understand your own experience. So in my world, in social work, counseling, sort of therapy, we talk a lot about empathy. And empathy is a way of, you know, being able to sort of be with people and what their experience is. So how is that sort of reconciled really in this way of thinking?
Well, you know, we go back to Steve and his child development, you know, 18 months for, I always forget the term, constancy of objects. And then object permanence, right. Yeah. So that takes 18 months, right? And then actually to realize that other people are observers like you takes a lot longer.
Yeah.
Empathy, well, why do you have a problem with empathy? Because it's difficult. You know, it's a difficult thing to do. It's kind of like another step.
Yeah.
Not only are they other observers, but how can I imagine what it's like to be Steve and be colorblind, let alone what it's like to, you know, to be someone who has a completely different life experience to myself, like you know, a street prostitute or a drug addict or something, or a person, a refugee that has a completely different background to myself, or a criminal or something. Yeah. So it's quite hard to do. And we can see why it's hard to do, can't we?
Can I just add to that, Georgia? The distinction between sympathy and empathy is huge, because unless you've lived the experience of the other person, then empathy can't exist, because you don't know that feeling. Like, I work as a counsellor too. The closest thing I can do is unpack the experience to a feeling of, say, hurt or embarrassment, and then I can connect. But like a pregnant woman who has had a miscarriage, I haven't got that empathy because I've never experienced that feeling.
I know what you're saying.
I can only have sympathy.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, you know, we don't really know. I don't really know what each of us experience when we see what we're calling yellow. you know, just something like that, or red or whatever. Like, I know what it looks like to me, but I'll never really know what it looks like to you. But of course, the experience might be different. We'd never know that. But because we have this communication and we say, well, you know, whatever I experience at the same time as you experience red is called red. So it's red. But we never have that level of empathy. You know, we can't go that far.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, anyone else got any final questions about just the whole idea of the formal approach, like looking at the form of our experience, looking at the form of our knowledge, looking at the form of the object, geometric form, that sort of thing. You know, there's stuff about comparing it with starting off with number or geometric figures, opposites, that sort of thing. Are people getting, I'm interested to know if people are getting clear on that stuff at all, if there's any sort of progress with that. I can see a few nodding heads. Does anyone want to make a comment about it and say what they're finding difficult?
Bernie, I'm still not really clear about the meaning of the word forms. Could you throw in a few synonyms? I mean, is it like concept? Is that something that you could substitute for forms?
Well, I wouldn't focus so. Sorry. Yeah. I wouldn't focus so much on the meaning of the word. I mean, I guess in a way, that's what I'm trying to get away from, and I'm getting more towards showing what they are. So, you know, like, let me just say that mostly in the universities and in teaching Plato and everything, the idea of forms is, and you might have got this before, or you might have read this or something, it's the idea of the forms is presented in the way that Aristotle interpreted it, which is kind of like that there are these, you know, models of a horse or models of the bed or models of the cup up in the sky, right? Up in this noetic realm that we've talked about. And that somehow everything in the world is like they are the molds for the casting. Everything is cast from that mold. And this is just such a strange way to...
Like a template?
Like a template, yeah. And this is such a strange way to interpret what you're actually reading here. Because there's all this stuff about like and unlike, about opposites, about these very equality. What is equality? About these very elementary forms. So what I say to you, Jane, is don't worry about definition. Just when you're saying, oh, I'm wondering what Bernie means by forms. Well, he's saying, well, what is two? What is when you see a wonky wheel on a car or something and you think, that's going to be a rough ride. What are you comparing that wheel with? The perfect circle. That's a form, right? The form of the circle. It has this geometric shape that you know, form. Number two, in itself, form. Like and unlike, form. Same and other, form. What I'm talking about in the analogy of the island and the sea, form. So I'm showing you various forms. This is the formal nature of things. It's not molds for the casting. Things participate in the forms in the way I was saying the number two things participate in two. That's the link. That's the link between the sensible reality and the forms. So there is this thing where you meditate, right? And you move away from all your sensible experience. It's just like meditation of that nature, and you enter the realm of the forms, right? There is that thing where you go through meditation where you separate yourself from sensible participation as much as you can to contemplate the forms in themselves, right? So that is an act. And this is what we get in the allegory of the cave in the Republic, where, you know, there, I think we've told the story a little bit, where leaves the cave of normal reality and you go up there and you do this kind of, if you like, deep meditation. But don't let think by that the forms aren't present and real in your world. Every one thing is the form of one. It has the form of oneness. There is often this idea that when you get into Platonism and when you get into, when you get an interpretation of Plato himself, that this kind of higher one, right, is just there so far from reality. But there's a sense in which it is present in every one thing. It's real and present in your world. You're not paying attention to it. That's what Plato's saying. Did that little rave help, Jane? No.
No, I need to understand it through words. I can't do away with that. So can I give you another word? Ideal?
Well, yeah, like the word idea does come from one of the...
Ideal.
Ideal. Well, you see, I'm not sure what you mean by that. That's the trouble. What I'm saying is do an exercise, and the exercise is, well, you know two things, but what is two in itself, and where is two in itself? Is it in my head? Is it in the thing? Is it somewhere else? Does it change? Does two in itself change with me, with the world? Would there be two if there wasn't you or me, or there wasn't the world? This is the only way I can take you to it, because if you say ideal, I don't know what you mean by that. If you don't mean what I just said then, like the ideal two, then it would be wrong. But if what I just said about two is the ideal of two, then it would be right. Okay. All right. Any more questions before I get going into the reading? Oh, we should get going. Oh, we'll definitely get going. No more questions. Okay.
Just one, Bernie, I've been listening to Jane as well, and I've been trying to use definitions to understand the forms as well. So I keep reading that forms are not real. They're not real.
So where do you read that?
I just Googled Plato and what the forms mean. So I'm just trying to get to the essence of what it means as well, and I'm sort of struggling too.
Okay, so what Plato says is they are the most real.
They're the most real.
The most real, yeah.
What we see is the most real, but that's from our experience.
No, the forms are the most real. So two is more real than two particular things, right? So from the point of view of materialists, right, from the opposite point of view, the pointing down people, right, the modern world, you would say they're not real. But Plato's whole thing of turning it all around is saying that the form of oneness, the form of two-ness, the form of the perfect circle, and the form of justice and equality, you know, how two things are equal to each other, these sameness and other, these forms are more real than any particular expression of them.
Okay.
So that's what he's saying. But in a way, you don't need to worry about that so much, about what's real and what's not real. He's saying they're important, right? Mm-hmm. And this is, if you're interested in Plato, you need to turn your attention to pay attention to that. So in your sensible experience, to pay attention to that. And it is like exercises, like it's not book learning, if you like. It's actually a reflection, you know, because all knowledge comes from, all learning comes from within. All knowledge comes from within. It's actually, for Plato, knowledge is something you do to yourself.
Mm.
You know, learning is something you do to yourself, right? So it's not just about writing out a definition. It's about actually seeing the world differently, seeing your experience differently, being aware of it in a different way.
Mm.
Like you would do with Eastern practices, Eastern mystical practices. All right, I'm going to leave you with that reflection, Anastasia, because we want to get to drinking. So now we're going to run late. But anyway, I hope that was helpful. Okay, in the reading this week, this passage can seem very difficult, infuriating, and simplistic, annoyingly simplistic, but there is actually some elementary conceptual stuff going on. So let me try to point these out without going into everything. It's introducing this notion of participation or sharing. So we have mentioned this before. Sensible things partake or participate in their formal nature. What makes a sensible thing beautiful is its partaking in the absolute form of beauty, sharing in that absolute form. There is a presence of absolute beauty in it. It's kind of communing with beauty. Beautiful things are made beautiful by beauty. Now, there's this funny passage about greatness and smallness. And it sounds quite silly, but it's actually making an important point, which maybe or maybe not could be made simpler. So let's have a look at it. For Plato and the Pythagoreans, arithmetic generation is not about addition, but it's kind of like a growth. It's like the original unity out of that grows the difference of arithmetic. So it grows out of itself. It's self-referencing. It creates itself from itself. And so we can think of this a bit like a cell dividing, where the cell creates the difference. If you know, a recently conceived cell then divides and divides again, and all the difference of the body, or a seed, if you like, creates all the difference of the tree out of itself in an important way. Numbers grow in this way, not as +1 or +2. They generate out of where they came from. Now, with this, when Plato says that great is greater by greatness, and 10 is greater by 2, greater than 2 by reason of manyness, the point is, and it's kind of obscure here, especially for us modern readers, the point is to pay attention to the formal generation, the growth, the becoming many process, rather than it's just about, you know, taking little pebbles and making, you know, 10 with 2 more pebbles out of 8. Okay, and so then there's this section about looking at greatness and smallness in terms of height, and the height of the people participating in the dialogue. Now we've got Phaedo, who's this kind of basketballer type, and we've got Socrates, who is famously short and also ugly, although in this case that's not relevant. And then we've got kind of Simmias in between. So it's a very simple point, and I'm just going to use my little babushka dolls here. Now, you know, here's Simmias here, and in relation to Phaedo, like, is short, right? But then if we take Phaedo away and only compare Simmias with Socrates, Then Simius is participating tallness. What's the point here? The point is that there is the form of tallness, but it's relative. And there's the opposite form of shortness, but it's relative in its expression. So you have to make a mark, right, to say, okay, above this is going to be tall and below this is going to be not tall. And you can imagine with a family in the doorway, you might have seen it, or up on a cupboard or something, where as the kids grow up, you mark how tall they are. Now you might say that the mother's height is, or the father's height is what distinguishes tallness. And when the sons get taller than the father, they are considered tall. They participate tallness relative to their father. So it's about making tallness is something that is absolute in itself. When it's expressed, you have to make the distinction of tallness. You have to make the distinction of tallness so that you can say what's opposite to tallness, what is shortness. So it's a simple point that we've been kind of approaching already in other ways. Now, another example might be saying, oh, where do you live, Bernie? You know, like, oh, I live in the East. East Brunswick, East Altona, east of the railway line. Oh, you mean east of the river. Oh, you mean Eastern Australia, the East Coast, Eastern Europe, the Orient, Asia, east of where? You must, east, west, you can think of as a form, but in order to find in order to use it in its particularity, you have to make a mark and say, east of the railway tracks, east of the river, or whatever it is. Now, understand what's being said here in the difference between a particular expression and the form itself. And you've understood a very important fundamental principle in Platonic formalism. East is the opposite to west. Greater is the opposite of smaller. East can never be west. Greater can never be smaller. Simius can participate greater or taller relative to Socrates, and he can also participate shorter relative to the mark of the basketballer Phaedo, right? But tallness and shortness in itself can never, tallness can never be shortness, and shortness can never be tallness. Think of that in terms of the island and the sea. Maybe a sandbar develops. Maybe the island gets an extension, right? It's either the island or the sea. Where's the shoreline? An opposite can never be its own opposite. So things can be greater and smaller, but greatness and smallness itself can never be each other. A form can never become other to itself. And yet it brings forth the opposite and opposes it, like pleasure brings forth, pain brings forth pleasure. But hang on. So an opposite can never be its own opposite, but hadn't we just said that opposites are generated from opposites? At about page 103, the answer is yes, opposite things can come from opposite things, but the abstract concept of opposite can never become its own opposite. But there are also, just to complicate things even more, special particular things that take on the characteristics of their opposite form, and these also oppose the opposite. For example, snow opposes heat. Cold snow opposes heat. Fire opposes cold. Or snow retreats and goes away from hot, or fire retreats and goes away from cold. And then he moves to example of odd and even. Remember, I said that the Pythagoreans and Plato saw the number series as an alternation of odd and even. Take 3. It can never be even, just as fire can never be cold. So the progression can move to 4, but 3 doesn't become 4 in this sense. The number 3 opposes the opposite of odd, which is even. Odd brings forth the idea of even, but never admits it, just like pain brings forth pleasure. Likewise with fire, when cold approaches, it never admits it, but perishes or goes away. And so, soul is to mortality, like 3 is to even. It never admits it. The soul is alive and does not admit dying, so it must always be alive. So I'll just give you these opposites in a little table, so we're clear on that. Okay, so opposite things never admit their other. In that 3 is 3, it's always odd and never admits even. Oddness is odd, never admits even. Fire is hot, never admits cold. Soul is alive, never admits dying. Remember when we started, we talked about 2 and how it is insensible and changing and like the divine. Well, in the same way, 3 is immortal. And according to Plato, in the same way, so is our soul in this argument. But notice that it is a very, very formal sense that the soul survives, only in that it is like the number 3 or like the number 1. The soul participates 1, so it exists in the same way that number 1 exists. Remember at the beginning when we said what is 2? How and where does it exist? Well, this proof is only a proof of existence of that sort. And that might be a little bit disappointing for those people looking forward to the afterlife. So that's the end of the reading. And after this, Socrates launches into something that's not so disappointing, this marvelous story about the earth, where you might want to read this sometime. Again, this is one of these myths that people do find interesting, and also like to find it in terms of its influence on later culture, especially Christianity. So Socrates seems to be recanting an Orphic myth of the afterlife. To imagine the afterlife, we should imagine the atmosphere above is like a sea. Where we live is like hollows in the depths of the ocean. Souls live around the surface of the atmosphere like we live around the sea. Water and sea are in our lives as air is to them. He also describes the underworld with these great chasms and giant rivers. When we enter the afterlife, we are guided by a guardian angel. There is a judgment day. Souls go to judgment and sentencing, and that determines where they end up. Hell, purgatory, or heaven. Those purified by philosophy live together without bodies and pass to still more beautiful abodes. This is around page 114c. What is the status of this myth? Let's see what Socrates has to say. Of course, no reasonable man ought to insist that the facts are exactly as I describe them, but that either this or something very like it is a true account of our soul and our souls and their future habitation. Since there is certainly evidence that the soul is deathless. This, I think, is both a fitting contention and a belief worth risking. for the risk is a noble one. We should use such accounts to enchant ourselves. And this is why I have already drawn out my tale so long. So that's 114D. Perhaps, what is he saying here? Perhaps one might call this a lullaby for the dying. And so we come to the end. Socrates says he will have a bath to save the folks from washing him. There's a good jailer, like the good thief on Calvary, and he'll sing his praise. And then there's the final end, which I'll read out to you now. Up until this time, most of us have been fairly successful in keeping back our tears. But when we saw that he was drinking, that he had actually drunk it, we could do so no longer. In spite of myself, the tears came pouring out, so that I covered my face and wept brokenheartedly. Not for him, but for my own calamity in losing such a friend. Crito had given up even before me and had gone out when he could not restrain his tears. Apollodorus, who had never stopped crying even before, now broke out into such a storm of passionate weeping that he made everyone in the room break down except Socrates himself, who said, "Really, my friends, what a way to behave. Why, that was the main reason why I sent away the women. Why? To prevent this sort of discordant behavior, because I'm told that one should make one's end in a reverent silence. Calm yourselves and be brave." This made us feel ashamed, and we controlled our tears. Socrates walked out, and presently, saying that his legs were heavy, lay down on his back. The man kept his hand upon Socrates, and after a little while examined his feet and legs, then pinched his foot hard and asked if he felt it. Socrates said no. Then he did the same to his leg, and moving gradually up this way, let us see that he was getting cold and numb. Presently, he felt him again and said that when it reaches the heart, Socrates will be gone. The coldness was spreading about as far as his waist when Socrates uncovered his face and said, and these were his last words, "Crito, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius. See to it and don't forget." "No, it shall be done," said Crito. "Are you sure there is nothing else?" Socrates made no reply to this question, but after a little while he stirred, and when the man uncovered him, his eyes were fixed. When Crito saw this, he closed the mouth and eyes. This was the end of our comrade, who was, we may fairly say, of all those whom we knew in our time, the bravest, also the wisest, and the most just. Okay, so that's the end of the Phaedo. Thanks for coming, everyone. I've really enjoyed the discussions, and I'm going to step out now and grab my glass of wine. So I'll be back soon.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. I got to go. Bye.
Yeah,
Hope to see you again at another course.
I'm sure you will.
I think you will.
See ya.
Nice
guys.
meeting you, Anastasia. Bye.
You too. Bye. Jane, we'll get to the bottom of it. I'm with you. Bye.
See ya.
Steve, are you there? Oh, maybe not. Yeah, so just on what he was saying, does that, in the question I had was, in Platonic formalism, do you always need a reference point, like to ground your understanding of something, like how he was saying you need to be east of something? Is that kind of the logic Plato follows?
I think I'm just waiting, Neil, for Bernie to get back. So there are actually two questions.
Okay.
Or, well, maybe two statements, but yeah, I'll certainly read that out for you.
Okay, no worries. Yeah. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Hello. Did I hear a question? Because Neil can't see. Right. Well, first of all, cheers, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Cheers. Yeah.
Cheers.
Okay.
We have a couple of questions and some statements, Bernie.
Yeah, go for it.
So Neil has said, so in Platonic formalism, we always need a grounding reference point. Is that correct? Has he? I guess that's a question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you need to make the distinction. You need to say, like you might draw a circle with your compass and say, this is expressing or partaking in the form of a circle. You might distinguish. Yeah, it needs to be expressed. The reference point would be the distinction itself, the distinction between same and other. So in the tallness thing, it's the distinction between taller and not taller. Or if you're distinguishing the opposite, it's between shorter and not shorter. So does that help?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of just remembering what you said earlier. So you were saying like the concepts themselves can't be flipped, but the ways in which they're described can be, like how you're saying like, yeah, like in reference to tall, like short and tall, like the things in themselves cannot be swapped, but just the way that they're referenced in relation to each other can be changed.
That's right. So it's trying to push you hard towards the nature of the form. Like you can say taller or you can say east or whatever, you know, and you are expressing the form, if you like, there without, you know, in a closer to the purity of the form. But if you say east of the river, or if you say taller than Socrates, you're making the mark, you're making the distinction, you know, in your particular sensible experience. Yeah.
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 Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
Steve, oh, sorry, Steve. Are you happy for me to read this out, or did you want to go ahead and say what you had read?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and say it, because when I was reading it, like, and it was about the, you know, odd doesn't admit even, and all the other examples. I was thinking though that, but even is in odd, you know, because 3 has 2 in it. You know, inside the form is the other form. So it's again that distinction point. It's like when I first started listening to this, you know, there's a continuum line between the opposites. When do they become the opposite? That's what I'm always wrestling with.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, when you did the island and the sea, you know, that distinction line. So in all of it, there's this distinction line always operating for me when I look at things like that.
Yeah.
And it also relates back to like when the soul doesn't admit death, but when we talked before, we from death comes life, from life comes death. So again, I see death inside life.
Yeah. Well, there's so much there, Steve, but I'll start with the last thing first. That's a really good thing to point out. There seems to me to be a direct contradiction in one of the earlier arguments for the immortality of the soul.
Yeah.
And this kind of last argument. And the earlier argument was, well, if there is going to sleep and waking up, then they must be dying and also waking up. And then that doesn't seem to match with this argument about the odd and even.
Yeah.
And so it's so obvious. It gets back to this issue of exactly what's going on with the reasoning here, and what there's this overriding theme in the dialogue about proving the immortality of the soul. And maybe the dialogue is all about that. But when I read it, I see these other things going on. And I don't know whether I describe to this group, but sometimes the way I see it, and certainly what I take out of it, it's a bit like one of those old musicals where, Noel Coward or whoever it was would write a musical and so that he could put in all his great songs, and then he'd have a narrative running over it. And then now those songs have all become jazz standards or whatever, and we've forgotten the narrative of the musical. Well, this has happened to a certain extent in Platonism, and you wonder if he was just doing that anyway. Because he placed all this stuff about opposites, about participation, about like one of the reasons we chose this is because it's got all the big themes, right? To use the musical metaphor, in that you find in the entire works of Plato in there. And then you get this stuff about, well, these myths are to enchant ourselves. And then you get a direct contradiction like that. And you wonder, well, what exactly is going on? Oh, and the other thing you get, of course, is that criticism that we had the week before last, was it? Where he's suddenly saying, first of all, I believe this view of Socrates, and now these arguments have come up, and now I'm completely in doubt. And then there's the question about the whole process of Socratic dialogue to come to truth. It's kind of like there's a lot of skepticism in here. These stories are to enchant ourselves so that when I die, you guys won't lament and I'll feel good. And if it's not true, it doesn't matter. and then this actually, this method that Socrates is using in order to prove the immortality is not much better than a sophist. So there's layers of stuff going on here that are not entirely straightforward. Now I'll go to the specific. With odd and even, no, it's a good question, and you probably need to know a little bit more about Platonic mathematics, but it's probably better to think about it in terms of left and right. Say, if you're walking along, you're walking from left to not left, which is right, and right, and not right, which is left, and so on, and they're opposites to each other. In the same way, fundamentally, you could think of it as a sine curve or something. You're moving from odd to even to odd. That's the fundamental process that's going on in counting, according to the Pythagoreans. And so when 3 moves to what we call 3, if you're counting each move, you're counting them 1, 2, 3, 4, rather than just saying odd, even, or 0, 1, 0, 1, whatever it is. You're counting binary. If you're actually counting them all, when you go to get to 3 is one of the lefts, if you like, and then going to 4, it's a right. And so it's switched over. And so you might think you go island C, for example, you go island C, C, you're going from one to the other, and they'll never be the other, even though in some important sense, as you've pointed out, 3 is in 4.
Yeah,
Yes,
but
it is in 4, yeah.
that is my point. Left and right, they are one, because you can't have right without left.
Yeah.
And you can't have 3 without 4, as you can't have 5. So everything is the same.
That's right. So in a sense, everything is the same. So in Platonism, all is one, right?
Yes, that's
But
what I get. Yeah.
Yeah, but there is difference. There is
Yeah.
is this difference within the one that can be reduced to the essential difference. But this is how complexity builds. So yeah. Anyway, it's great you've pointed all that out, because it's kind of all difficult to deal with at this point, I'd say. Yeah.
Well, I think that, like, tonight, I think how you built this conversation is really good, because tonight everything just dropped into place for me. When you were first saying same as in the other, and I think there was a few questions I could understand Anastasia's take on it as well. Like, I'm thinking, yeah, that's how I'm thinking. And then all of a sudden, the one, it just stood out for me that without left, there is no right. Without east, there is no west. So everything is one, and then you dissect it down. But yeah, no, really good, really good.
Oh, good. Okay.
Bernie, Joanne has a question here. How did Aristotle, as a student of Plato, define the forms in such a non-Platonic way?
I know, it's a great question, Joanne. It really is a great question.
Yeah.
Because that's what we know from Plato, isn't it? It's Aristotle's interpretation, which is why I think everyone's having a lot of trouble distinguishing what the forms are, because we're trying to think of it in that analytical, scientific, conceptual way, which is what Aristotle was about, right?
It's analytical, yes. I would be a little bit offended as a Platonist to say that it's scientific, because I think Plato's scientific too. He's better in that way, I think. But I totally take your point. We know Plato's theory of forms from his dialogues. We do know it, and if you want to pay attention to the dialogue, one of the whole things about setting up this organization is to say, let's go and read Plato ourselves. Now, I know you guys are finding it hard, right? But and maybe it's a bit mean, right? Rather than giving you a summary. But one of the reasons for doing it is to say, look what Plato says. You've seen the opposites come up over and over again. If you go to university and do an undergraduate course where you study Platonism, they won't tell you the opposites. They will give you this Aristotelian version. Now, there is the question about why Aristotle got it so wrong. And you can sort of address that. But the fact is that he did. And that our society and our philosophy is all in this mode of looking down, to use our metaphor, or looking outward, materialism. And it finds it very difficult, as we said at the beginning, to think in this other way, as we are finding, to think in this other way, which is opposite. And what Plato is proposing is so extreme that it seems crazy. And it looks very different, like in the way Anastasia said, where she read something which said, their forms are not real. Well, they are exactly what is real. They're the essence of things. The essence of things is like the essence of numbers, the essence of forms. So answering the question of why Aristotle got it wrong is a bit hard, but answering the question of why Plato is taught so badly today is probably because it's so difficult to teach him in this way. And also people don't want to, because they want to reinforce their own view. Platonism just doesn't cut it today. People go to the East for their mysticism. They don't go to their own tradition. and they don't see, because this Aristotelianism has, and Christianity and various other layers of things, and then abuses of Platonism have sort of put all these layers over Plato so that you can't see Plato anymore. Does that help?
Yeah, but like the Eastern stuff, and Plato has a sense of freedom about it, has a sense of autonomy, whereas everything else in materialism has a sense of control. And so there's a lot of power by leadership in that. And I can see how that has evolved over the centuries, because you don't want free thinking people autonomous. You know, they can't control it. That's how I've seen that, you know. My idea, what I've been thinking now about the forms, is that someone or something designed everything perfectly and then ripped up all the plans. And we can then tap into that imagination of what perfect is.
Okay, I like that. Okay, so yeah, anyone else? Oh, Jackie, are you still reading out comments? Because people can just speak to them if they want.
Yeah, Jane has actually said, has Plato's argument, and I guess this is to everybody, has Plato's argument for the immortality of the soul, based on his theory of opposites, living, dying, persuaded anyone in the group?
I used to ask that question. I've stopped asking it. Yeah, great, Jane. Well, how do people feel about the argument for the immortality of the soul, the overriding argument that goes through this whole thing? We've dealt with all these particular things, but how do people feel about the argument, and what's it doing?
I think it's he's persuading us to consider both sides of the coin. That's the way I see it.
Yeah.
There may be and maybe not. There's
Okay. Anyone else? So are you still there? I can only see some image. Hello? Okay. All right. Anyone else?
Yeah, sorry, I am here. I am here.
Yeah. What I wonder what your thoughts are. Were you persuaded by, because I remember you made some comments very early on about this matter.
okay.
No, I don't think he's convinced me.
Okay. What, because the arguments aren't powerful enough?
I think so. Yeah.
What do you think he's doing? What do you think's going on in the dialogue? Do you think that's his aim?
Does he want people to discredit his argument?
Well, does he?
So,
You know.
so then, like, does he have doubt in his own argument?
Well, have we seen that? Didn't we see that a couple of weeks ago? That was, you know, it was all brought into doubt, and there was this question about the whole method of finding truth in this way, and is it any better? Socrates says, am I any better than, those people competing for the, to persuade the audience, the sophists? Am I any better than them? And then he goes on with the argument.
I think what he's doing is he's arguing for and setting up his own experiment, because he calls it out later where he said he could go, he could have run off to some other place, he could have disappeared, but he's decided to stay here and face this and argue this out. So I think he's being loyal to his philosopher, credo, and he's going to put it to the test.
I still think he's asking us to consider both arguments.
to have an element of doubt about either side.
To have an element of doubt. And reading through some of the paragraphs, I can't help thinking about Orpheus, and Orpheus persuading the gods, or persuading the gods to give Eurydice back. But then he got to the entrance of Hades, and he sees Eurydice turning back, and it's like because she can't come back into the physical world, really, and the gods never intended that she come back, and they tricked Orpheus, is the way I sort of saw it.
Okay.
And I just wondered how, it was Plato influenced by this mythology.
Yeah, I don't know. There's in our Republic group, which is on Wednesday nights, we are right at the end, of course, and there's the myth of which you will remember, Kula, but others mightn't have read it, which is a myth about a guy who died on a battlefield, and but then came back to life. So it's one of these near-death experiences things. So he kind of went into how to experience the afterlife and the whole process that goes on there. And then he was sent back, and then someone found him on the battlefield, and he was in fact alive. And so that's a kind of a story about someone coming back, whereas of course Socrates, he didn't come back.
Yep.
Okay, anyone else? How are we going, Jackie? Have we got some more comments?
At this point, no. I think we've, but everyone is more than welcome to speak.
I could talk all night, but I'm aware that I would talk over everybody else.
You know what we should do, Steve? We probably should, because some people might need to go. So we'll do what we usually do. But anyway, I'm it's our last night, so I'm happy to have it.
I've got to go.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Well, I'll just say I'll wind it up, Georgia, and say
thank you so much.
Yep. Thanks for coming. And thank you everyone for coming. The conversation in this group has been fantastic. It's just been really good, and I've really enjoyed it. I hope you guys have too. And if you're interested, do come back, and we can do lots of other reading that you might enjoy as well. So thanks for coming, and might see you next time. Otherwise, bon voyage. And yeah, and I'm going to hang around, and a few of us might hang around.
Keep us in touch with what's coming up in the future.
I will. Yeah. Yep, I will. Okay, so that's done. Steve, what were you going to say? Don't talk all night. Don't talk all night. Just.
I was just saying, I'm aware that I can talk, and so I don't want to butt into everyone's conversations. Look, for me, this journey of philosophy. I mean, I've always been a sociologist. I've studied it. I stand by that, and that's what I like, And I got into philosophy when I had a triple heart bypass 3 years ago, and I expired during the operation, and they had to revive me, bring me back. And so I didn't see the light. I didn't see some tunnel or anything like that. But I do know that I just went dark, and there was no pain and there was nothing. I was out for a few minutes too. And so I just knew I've had a sense of calmness and a sense of, there's no fear for me. And so I started really studying philosophy or getting into it. And I find his argument compelling, and I find it mathematically probable, the way that he structures an argument just with a thing, and then with a concept, and then with mathematics, it proves all the way through those little, the different examples it gives. And I find it fascinating. I've really enjoyed this course. It's been great.
Well, great. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve. Well, I hope to see you back sometime. Read something else. That'd be good. Yeah. How you going, Joanne?
Yeah, good. I'm not convinced, but I'm not unconvinced. And I think that's because reading the Phaedo, had Plato not decided to finish it then, I think someone else would have piped up and said, oh, I was convinced, Socrates, until this happened. And I think it could just keep going on forever, because Socrates did say that he's just saying this to pacify everybody and to pacify himself as well. So he said that there was no definitive proof. So how can you argue something that doesn't have any definitive proof, if that makes sense?
Yeah, yeah, but we do recognize, don't we, Joanne, that there's more going on than just the overriding narrative of the immortality of the soul.
Oh yeah, of course.
He's talking about the theory of forms and the opposites and just generally the formal approach, which is very different from the way we normally think about reality. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what I pay attention on. Maybe I'm showing my bias. I don't know, in reading the Phaedo. I mean, some people like the Phaedo for its overriding argument. But I mean, people that get into Plato see lots of layers going on, lots of things going on, and see a development in some of this more, what I see as more interesting stuff going through the dialogues. If you go and read the Republic, or you read the Theaetetus, which we're about to read, you'll see some these kind of ways of seeing will expand out a bit more for you, hopefully.
Have you? Sorry,
I was just going to say, I think, from my understanding, a lot of Plato's works end with a kind of like a conundrum, or there's no actual end. It's often another question or something. Is that right?
Well, that's right, Vessa. Yeah. Well, one way of depicting it is actually the early dialogues tend to be like that, and then, like, by the time you get to the Phaedo, which is considered a middle dialogue, you can see that he's making positive arguments. There's no doubt about it. So when we read the Euthyphro, there was no conclusion. Remember Euthyphro? They just, Euthyphro just ran off and said, "See you later, guys. I've got something to, I got somewhere I got to be." What's interesting about the Theaetetus, which we're going to read in autumn, is that that's a late dialogue that's inconclusive. But maybe not if we consider that it actually flows on to the Sophist. And the Sophist, in my view, takes the theory of forms, or takes Plato's philosophy to the highest level it gets to, really. So that's more, those late ones are more conclusive, more positive in their approach. But all the same, there's skepticism running all the way through. There's always doubt. There's always twists where you're always put on edge. You never feel comfortable that, okay, guys, here's the doctrine, take it all in. It's always putting you on edge, I think, to make you do the thinking yourself.
So quickly is I recall reading somewhere that in one of Plato's dialogues, the whole theory of forms is kind of thrown into disarray. Do you know which one that is, Bernie?
Yeah, sure. So this keys into what you were saying earlier, Joanne. There's a dialogue called the Parmenides, which is also very important it was written probably at the same time as the Theaetetus and the Sophist. That's the way people speculate, for good reasons, because there's connections between them and oblique references to them. So there is this, from the Aristotelian version of what the theory of forms is, I was talking molds for the casting and everything. that is demolished. So what happens is, it's an interesting thing. What happens is Parmenides, I think I've mentioned Parmenides, he was like the king of the skeptics, you know, of the doubters. And he had this follower, Zeno, who did Zeno's paradoxes, you know, like Achilles racing the tortoise. You might have seen that. And anyway, always, you know, skeptical about anyone who claimed, made any positive claims in science, really anti-science in a way. And so anyway, but the trouble was in constructing the narrative is that Parmenides was long dead. Well, actually, he died when Socrates was very young. So in setting up, he obviously wanted to set up a conversation between Socrates and Parmenides, because, you know, wouldn't that be great? Because Plato had a great respect for Parmenides. And so he sets it up so this teenage Socrates is talking to Parmenides, and Parmenides is the authority. He's the main, he's like the Socrates in this, he's the main one. And so teenage Socrates gives this kind of sketchy, kind of immature version of the theory of forms, which is a bit like Aristotle's version, the cast for the molding sort of thing. And then that's demolished, right, in the very first part of the dialogue. And then the dialogue starts. And so the way it's interpreted by our Aristotelian friends at some of the universities is that Plato abandoned his theory of forms.
Yeah, I recall listening to a podcast, and that's the exact conclusion that they said, which I thought was odd, because why would you spend so much time describing this theory and then just say, oh, well, I guess it's not true. And just like, you know what I mean? Didn't make sense.
So when you were listening to the podcast, was a fundamental form, the form of opposites, the form of equality?
I don't remember. This was a while ago. I don't
well,
think so.
What I would tell you is that it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be because they have this idea that there's the ideal horse up there and it's expressed in the horse, or there's this ideal table and it's the mold for the cast of all tables. It's this kind of idea, not that, like, you know, the number 2 or the number 1 or the circle or sameness and other, like these very elementary formal things, like mathematical, logical sort of formal things are the forms. They don't think that. And so when they go and read Parmenides, they think, oh, you know, teenage Socrates is giving the theory of forms and Parmenides demolishes it. Therefore, it's all gone. And, you know, it's just such an appallingly bad interpretation that it just seems to me and to other people who are into Plato that it's unbelievable that it could be perpetuated in the universities today, because it's just such a bad interpretation. You know, like if you did a bit more reading, you would see this. You would get to the Parmenides and you say, well, that's a ridiculous interpretation of the Parmenides.
But is something in it that it's teenage Socrates who is in that dialogue or in that episode, and then you've got aged Socrates, you know, professing the true theory. So that it seems to make sense for me. Like
of course, yeah, of course, Steve. Something else that's going on there is I think that these people think that, you know, Socrates is Plato, right? Socrates is the mouthpiece of Plato. But in these later dialogues, you know, this is one thing I've emphasized with you guys. What is clear about the main characters in the dialogues is they're all skeptics. And it's not just Socrates. In the late dialogues, you get Parmenides himself leading. You get a follower of Parmenides leading in the Sophist, and you get another skeptic leading in the Laws. So they kind of ignore these other people who are leading that are not Socrates because Socrates is Plato. So there's this attachment to Socrates being the mouthpiece for Plato, and they don't get beyond that.
Mm.
And then they get the teenage Socrates in a story, in a play,
Mm.
defending the forms. And so Parmenides demolishes it. Therefore, Plato's demolishing his own theory. You know, it's just such a ham-fisted, what's the right word, interpretation of the dialogues that it's just shameful that it's being perpetuated. I feel. So,
and Bernie, I think you mentioned this in one of the first classes. We don't actually have any writings of Socrates, do we? Or are there any fragments or anything like that?
exactly. We don't have any writings of Socrates, and Socrates made a point of not writing anything down. He was against writing down.
Yeah. And
actually, there are some in the fictional Socrates. There are what are perhaps believed to be the arguments for why Socrates didn't write anything down, especially in the Philebus, which we read in Platonic Love, where Socrates makes the argument against writing, why it's dangerous and why you shouldn't do it, and you should do all teaching orally, because the teaching should be an engagement with the person you're teaching with, not an anonymous thing. So, so no, he never wrote anything down, and so you'll see this confusion. But you know, this is fair enough in popular culture. You'll see, like on the internet, you might see memes, and it'll have a quote from a quote, and then it'll say Socrates, right? You think, what's going on there? Of course, it's a quote from Plato, and Plato's character of Socrates in the plays. And so this is perpetuated in popular culture. But what is shameful is that this is perpetuated by our universities as well, and really discredits the Platonic point of view, which is understandable because the prevailing point of view is the Aristotelian. The Aristotelian thinks that the Platonic point of view is mad. I mean, it looks mad, right? I've tried to present that to you early on. It looks mad from the Aristotelian point of view. So, so it sees it that way, and it doesn't really have any investment in giving it any credit or legitimacy.
Hey, I've got to go. Is there a curriculum? Like, have you got do I go on the site to find out what's
the website? So, well, yeah, well, if you go to courses on the website, it'll show you all the courses that we've run, and all of them we intend to repeat. So have a look at that. So after Easter, we're running geometry, which is hands-on drawing.
Yep.
And we're running Theaetetus. So I think you'd be interested in Theaetetus, Steve. It's it's for someone who's really interested in the philosophy. It's a great dialogue. And then we're also running just this one again. Yeah.
Okay. What was the other thing? Are you going to go back to face-to-face?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. I want to go back to face-to-face, but the transition's going to be difficult because some people want to go online and some people want to go face-to-face.
Yeah.
And the hybrid format, everyone says don't do it.
Yeah.
So we're already doing face-to-face with geometry. We'll see how we go. Maybe we'll do a bit more advertising, get more classes, and we can run parallel classes where there's one face-to-face doing the Republic, and then the next night there's one that's Zoom. I don't know. I don't know. But...
All right. I'm going to go. Thank you very much, Bernie. It's been fantastic.
Yeah.
Bye-bye, Joanne.
Bye, Steve.
Bye, Basso. Hopefully see you in the...
Bye, Steve.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for an insight into your world, Steve. It was really good.
It was amazing.
Thank you.
Yes, right into it.
Good
So what
night.
are you studying, Joanne? What?
So I'm doing a Bachelor of Arts, but my major is archaeology. So I studied, ancient Greece is my thing. I'm currently studying the 5th century Athens, actually. So it's very in this Platonic territory.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. Well, we should rope you in to do something.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've just started learning about what democracy actually is in the context of the Athenian state. So that's very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you if you do come back, we can chat about doing something.
Okay.
You know,
Well,
I'm sure there's
we're-
something there that
Yeah.
I'm going to say
Historical stuff.
goodbye. And let you
Okay,
two.
Vaso. Yeah.
Thank you.
Nice to meet
Okay.
you,
Stacey's here as
Vaso.
well.
Nice to meet
Bye.
you.
Stacey's
Sorry.
here as well. Bye.
See you guys.
Bye, Stacey. Bye.
Vaso visited me.
Oh, so nice.
Yes. See you guys. Thank you,
Bye.
Bernie. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie.
See ya.
I won't keep you for too long, Bernie, but I was
No.
just going to ask, I've seen previously advertised you do Platonism and Christianity. Are you
Yes.
planning on running that session again?
Yeah, well, we're thinking of running that again, leading up to Christmas. So sort of in our last thing before, like maybe because it's a Christian theme,
Yeah.
Yeah. So we people definitely want to run that again. People who have done the course want to do it again and are thinking that it needs to be broken into 2. I'm always reluctant with that because I think that so your dedicated students want that, but it's sometimes things can move a bit too slowly for everyone else. So it's a bit of a hard decision, but people. We actually ran that as a lecture series. We had about 30. It was on Zoom. We had about 30 people coming. Is a bit different than these. These are more like tutorials.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're definitely thinking of running it again, and there's been some talk of running that at the Hellenic Museum as well. So look, just check out the website, and as soon as any decisions been made, we'll advertise it. Of course,
Cool.
hopefully we're coming out of COVID now, and we can make a bit more long-term plans and decisions on Zoom, face-to-face.
And so in that one, you're just discussing mostly Neoplatonism?
Oh, in the relationship?
No, in Christianity and Platonism.
We're discussing Neoplatonism, but well, interesting. Not necessarily. Plato, and if do you know Middle Platonism?
Not very well, but yeah.
Okay, so well, there's a couple of things. There's Hellenistic Judaism, which was very influential on Christianity, and basically then died out. Maybe they all became Christians, I don't know. But there's also the early church fathers. They were actually before, the anti-Nicene fathers, before the Council of Nicaea. Yeah, just nod your head when you know what I'm talking about.
No, I know. I have studied this.
So they were before the Neoplatonists, as in Plotinus.
Yes,
right?
that's what I meant.
So,
yeah.
So whereas Augustine, St. Augustine and some of the late church fathers, they were influenced pretty much directly by Neoplatonism.
Mm-hmm.
They say that Origen from Alexandria actually went to school with Plotinus.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So was taught by the same teacher.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's kind of before Neoplatonism. So yeah, it's not that divided up. There's I don't know whether you know Philo the Jew. We've got a lot of his works. Yeah. So there's Philo the Jew. There's the wisdom texts in the Bible.
Yeah.
There's John's, the preface to John's Gospel. That's Stoic. And then there's the clear correspondence between the myths in Plato and the myths of the afterlife that then start to evolve within Christianity. So yeah, lots of connections there. Yeah,
I actually study Gnosticism, so Gnostic Christianity. So it's like it's in this cultural milieu. It's like Neoplatonism with, you know, Gnosticism with, like you said, Hellenic Judaism. Yeah, and it's just I find it so interesting because it's kind of like everything was happening at the same time and everything influenced everything else. So it's sometimes a bit difficult to distinguish between the different philosophies.
Yeah, and the evidence is scant. You know, we have some stuff really well represented, basically what the Christians liked and kept.
Yeah,
and then we have other stuff we don't know about. Yeah. I'm about to read Origen's I've never read it, his Contra Celsum. You know, there's this text where he Origen criticizes someone that we didn't know about, didn't even know he existed, apart from this huge tome that he wrote against this Platonist, basically saying that, well, actually, Christianity is Platonic and more, you know. We've got everything you've got, and we've got more as well, because we've got the revelation of the Christ, you know, the Christ on earth. Yeah. So where are you studying this Gnosticism?
So I actually am a Gnostic Christian. So I'm part of the Gnostic Church here in Melbourne. So yeah, we're the Apostolic Johannite Church. So we are kind of in that Johannine. So it's kind of like the Gospel of John and that kind of stream of Gnosticism. So more like a Sethian style of Gnosticism is kind of what we're about.
So this is a new organization?
No, so it's been around for about 20 years.
Okay, the gospel of did you say the Gospel of what? John or Thomas?
No. So the Gospel of John. So obviously that's a canonical gospel. But so at the moment, like I've just given a lecture about. So we've gone through basically the Nag Hammadi corpus. So within that, there's a text called the Apocryphon of John. Have you heard of that? The Secret Book of John?
Yes.
Yeah, so we've just done an exposition on that, but there's a follow-up text called the Trimorphic Protonoia, which is kind of a bit more apocalyptic, but it's also kind of like explains in a lot more detail some of the more obscure things that come up in the Apocryphon of John. So yeah, we've just given a lecture on that. But I find it fascinating. Like I'm really I love studying history, and I like studying this kind of material because I find it to be very like rich, and it's very spiritually rewarding at the same time, if that makes sense. Because there's all these kind of really profound ideas that are kind of being floated, that are floating around, and then
what a time it was.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I wish I was alive in Alexandria at that time.
Well, there might have been some violence and also some pandemics that were a lot harsher than the one we've been through.
Yeah, but imagine going to the Library of Alexandria.
That's right. Yeah. Hey, Joanne, I gotta get going, but I tell you what, pop me an email, and we should talk because you're I don't know anything about your church, but I've read a lot of this stuff, and I'm sure there's some connections between our organization and yours. So
awesome.
Pop me an email, and maybe we can have some sort of meeting or something. And
cool. Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thanks for this course, Bernie. I've really enjoyed it. I've learnt a lot.
Oh, well, good. Well, I'm glad you came, and I'm glad you revealed your background.
Yeah.
I probably would have been, I'll be a lot more careful when I do my Platonism and Christianity if you were in the audience.
No, I'd love to hear what you'd say.
Maybe you should be presenting part of it, seriously.
Sure.
Maybe, maybe someone from your organization, it would be really good to work together in presenting this material, because basically it's material that has been easy in our culture, is really powerful influence in our culture, and then you know, mainstream Christianity just kind of papered it all over, didn't it? So
Yeah.
now we're
yeah.
kind of coming out of that. You know, the church is not so powerful anymore, and people are becoming interested in this background.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, yeah, I'll shoot
All
you
right.
off an email and we'll see
Yeah.
how it goes.
Be in touch.
Cool.
All right. Thank you,
Well,
Joan.
thanks,
See
Bernie.
ya.
Have a good night. Bye.
Okay, bye.